Hey guys, I'm Sun. I'm a privacy and security researcher, and you're watching the Privacy Guides. In today's episode, I want to show you guys how to use Google services more privately. Now, this is not an endorsement for Google, and actually quite the opposite. Google has a reputation for being super bad for privacy. Whew, I have to remember to read. That being said, if we're honest with ourselves, everyone ends up using Google services now and then, either because there's no alternative, because searches are better, or because our boss forces us to things like this. So in today's episode, we're gonna have a look at how to make things more private. First things first, if we go to myaccount.google.com, there are a whole bunch of settings that we can configure to tell Google not to track as much about us. Now, Google has a history for not respecting these settings, but we'll take for granted that they do, or else there's not much we can do actually. That's why I always recommend not using Google services when possible, but yet again, we all do once in a while. So if we go into privacy and personalization, we want to set a few things up here. First things first, activity controls. So Google tends to track all the searches we do. It tracks the apps we use, it tracks where we are. In the context of Android, things get even more heated. Today's episode is not about Android. If you have an Android phone, essentially you have a tracking device in your pocket. More on this in the future. If you want to learn more about that, smash the subscribe button, we'll get there. But yeah, in the context of the desktop, web and app activity is something that we would want to pause. So when we are in this view here, this here, as you can see, is paused. And once it's paused, we also want to make sure that we delete past activities. So if we click here and we go into Manage Activity, then we would want to click Delete, select Always, and then I have nothing here because I don't track these things, but you guys would likely have a whole bunch of things and you want to click Delete. Now that this is done, let me see if we go back. Moving down here, as you can see, there's also settings specific to YouTube. I tend to allow YouTube to store my history. Why? Because the YouTube algorithm will recommend videos that I tend to enjoy more. So there are trade-offs, and I will be talking about those more in the context of an episode on how to set up Spotify for privacy, or to be more private, I should have said. But yeah, in the context of YouTube, I am consciously allowing Google to store this. So I also have to keep that in mind when I watch stuff on Google. And if I want to watch something that I don't want that to be tied to my identity, well, then I would watch it over Tor or in another browser, or et cetera, but those are more advanced topics. So we'll keep things simple. Right now, I allow YouTube to store my search history, not my search, but my viewing history. And I do not allow it to store my searches, because what we search for reveals a whole lot about who we are. So I tend to disable this here. Again, if you do not want or want to purge your YouTube history, you would want to disable this, then go and manage activity and delete your activity like we just did in the context of web and app activity. So moving down, add personalization. I tend to essentially turn that off. That means that Google will not show ads relevant to me. So hopefully that means that they're not profiling us as much. Okay, going back to my Google account. Once we're here, account storage. Oh, actually, we'll do this one first. We keep your account protected. So if we go into here, your devices, you would want to have a look at your devices, make sure that no devices there are kind of rogue. In the context of my setup, I have a Firefox setup that when I quit Firefox, all cookies and browser data will be flushed. That's actually a good privacy and security practice. More on this in the episode I created on Firefox. I'll link that in the description. But all of those here, multiple windows, that's me. I'm on Mac, but I spoof my user agent, so it's seeing me as a Windows user. So if there are things here that you don't know what they are, you would want to sign them out and change your password. Moving along, recent security activity. If you click here, I just signed out a whole bunch of those windows this morning, but that's where you kind of see what's happening from a security perspective. This being more of a privacy episode, we'll skip through this pretty quickly. You do want two-factor authentication to be turned on. That should be the case for all of your web services. If you want to learn more about 2FA, there's a whole bunch of episodes on the Privacy Guide series. Now that one, third-party access, that's really critical. A lot of websites will let you log in using your Google account, and apps and websites actually. Now the problem with this is usually it gives them access to some of your data. So a little bit or a lot, that's actually, those kind of add-ons are really, really linked to a lot of privacy data breaches, such as the Cambridge Analytica scandal on Facebook. So essentially, there was this app that asked users to allow them to have access to some of their data, but usually people just allow it, not knowing what's happening. And those third-party apps tend to then aggregate a lot of our personal information. So any apps here that you don't know what they are, you would want to revoke their access. Tube Manager is actually one of my open source projects. It's how I manage my episodes on YouTube. So that's why it's the only one that I allow here. Going back to my Google account storage, as you can see, I am using none. I highly recommend avoiding Google storage. When you upload files to Google storage, the files are not encrypted, meaning Google employees or Google algorithms can read through those files and further profile you. Historically, that's probably why Gmail was pushed so much by Google. Historically, Google was going through our emails and using that very personal data to profile us. I think this is no longer the case, but nonetheless, I try to want to put as little of myself onto Google servers. So, and by the way, while we're at it, if you did install the Google Drive app on your Mac or PC, I would recommend removing it because that gives Google access to your file system, which is pretty bad from a privacy standpoint. So that's pretty much it for those settings. You may have noticed that I'm using Firefox. I would recommend avoiding Google Chrome. The problem with Chrome is, well, there are many, but from a privacy standpoint, the problem is when you log into Google services, it usually logs you into Chrome as well. What that means is anywhere you go on the internet, theoretically speaking, Google could correlate this traffic to you because you're logged in at the browser level. So I would recommend using a browser that isn't Google. I personally use Firefox. Again, I have a full episode on how to configure Firefox for privacy. I'll link that in the description. But yeah, I'm using Firefox, and not only am I using Firefox, but you may have noticed this blue line here that isn't on the other tabs. That blue line is something that Firefox multi-account containers allows me to do. So it allows me to set Google domains in a container so that anything I do within the container essentially is like if I had a separate browser. So it compartmentalizes cookie and browsing data. Again, we can leak our identity and kind of help those trackers correlate traffic through our IP address. But in the context of cookies and more invasive practices, this really helps. So I would recommend using Firefox and using the Firefox multi-account container browser extension and then setting it up. Again, all of this is talked about in the episode on Firefox. So this being said, let me just look at my notes quickly. Oh yeah, if you're in Firefox, and that should be the case for any browser you use, but I'll talk about it quickly in Firefox, you would want to go in Firefox Preferences and then go in Privacy and Security and make sure that you enabled tracking content. So essentially, this will prevent a lot of trackers from tracking us, and a lot of those are linked to Google. So I tend to disallow any third-party cookie, block tracking content, crypto miners, and fingerprinters. Again, more on this in the episode on Firefox, but that's something I do. And to be honest, I don't fully trust Firefox. Firefox is developed by the Mozilla Foundation, which is funded mainly by Google, which creates quite a conflict of interest here. Google pays Firefox to be the default search engine, but who knows what other shenanigans are happening. So what I do recommend is installing Privacy Badger as well. So Privacy Badger, let's just open it up here. Whoa, privacy, Jesus. Okay, Privacy Badger. So I recommend installing Privacy Badger as well. The Privacy Badger is developed by the EFF, so the Electronic Frontier Foundation. So it allows us to have like two different ways of making sure that we really block all of this tracking stuff. Okay, so last but not least, if you really want to make sure that you cannot be tracked by Google even at the IP level, I would recommend using the Tor browser. So the Tor browser will route your traffic through the dark net, and that will make sure that you have a new IP on a regular basis so that you cannot be tracked at the IP level. Now, if you do use Google search here, for instance, well, you would want to make sure that you're not searching for something that can reveal your true identity. Now, Tor will be much slower and quirkier, but the searches will be routed through a network of nodes across the world, so it's really hard to identify you. And sometimes it shows up in weird languages here, so let me just try to switch this to EN for English. By the way, it does, so as you can see already here, damn it, things get kind of complicated. If you're on a language like this and you really clearly have no idea, most of the times on Google services, you can switch a language here and then imagine that this means go or something, and then agree whatever, because this is disposable. Once you flush Tor, it will usually create a new circuit, meaning a new set of nodes, and your IP will be cycled, and also browsing history is not saved by default. Now, if ever, for some reason, when you're using Tor, things are ridiculously slow, you can try clicking on this button here. And usually what this does is it will create a new circuit. So sometimes it routes you through a circuit that is a little congested or has a longer route throughout the world. So that sometimes will make things faster. But when you're downloading files, for instance, don't expect anything faster than 500 kilobytes per second. So that's all I have for you today. This is how I use Google services more privately. Again, this does not apply to mobile. On mobile, it's a whole other game. I have a few episodes on how to set up iOS for privacy, and all of what I talk about in the context of iOS clearly applies to Android philosophically. So I'll link to that episode in the description as well. Take care, guys. Bye.